Over the last couple of weeks, when we've seen a massive military buildup in the Caribbean and the open threat of a U.S. invasion of Venezuela. And basically, when I began to hear Trump supporters begin to justify this or promote a possible war with Venezuela by invoking the Monroe Doctrine, I knew I had to get this guest back on the show. So to offer a historical perspective on the United States and Venezuela, please welcome back to the show, Greg Grandin.
Thanks for having me, Will.
So, Greg, like I said, I just want to begin first with, like I said, we're sending an aircraft carrier group to the Caribbean, but this is all in the context of this kill spree that the Trump administration is going on, blowing up these fast boats in the Caribbean, just killing people and then sharing the snuff film with the media to promote what they're doing, supposedly as a war on narco traffickers, which are linked to Venezuela. You've gave us a little preview of an article you wrote that's coming out where you describe this as sort of government by murder incorporated. So just to begin here, to what extent are we already at war with Venezuela, and what do you make of, like I said, this murder spree?
Well, if you look at the U.S. war on drugs, the U.S. has always been at war always been fighting a war on drugs, at least since 1973. And, the thing about, Trump is that he's insisting it's not a metaphor, that it actually gives him extraordinary powers to do whatever he wants. And the thing about Venezuela and the attacks on the Go Fast boats, which started September 2nd and have accelerated in like any good serial killer, I think forensic psychologists call it when serial killers start to decompose, they start going quicker and quicker in their kills, and that's what's happening. The hits are getting more frequent, and they're expanding out of the Caribbean into the Pacific, and what's interesting about it is that the first one on September 2nd was really designed, I would argue, by Rubio and what one could identify as a war party within the Trump administration that sees Latin America in very ideological terms, that wanted to preempt. I don't want to say a moderate party within the Trump administration, but certainly there was a sector in the Trump administration that thought they could do business with Maduro, and Maduro would certainly sign any contract at this point that Trump put in front of him if it just calmed things down. Richard Grenell, who's Trump's special envoy for special missions, I wish I had a special envoy for special missions, basically represents Chevron. And Chevron is a company that kind of went along with Chavez. Remember where Chavez back in the day, his nationalization. Exxon rejected it whole cloth and pulled out and moved its operations to Guyana, British Guyana. But Richard Grenell, just 2 weeks before that attack, got a variance against the sanctions in which Chevron started pumping oil, and it did start pumping oil and sending it to Port Arthur to be refined. And those attacks, those cold-blooded, premeditated murders on innocent people who had no charges brought against them, no allegations, no evidence, was Rubio's bid to preempt the people who thought that they could make a deal with Maduro and normalize relations a bit. So, the bigger picture is, America's firsters don't think the United States should superintend a global world order based on free trade, that the world should be broken up into spheres of interest with different power centers, and those power centers would exert their authority over their hinterlands. And obviously, Latin America is the United States' hinterland. So the Trump administration has to get Latin America into order. But there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can, okay, we'll just deal with whoever's there. We'll sign contracts and we'll just, get them down. Or we could see it the way Rubio and all of those Republican congressmen in Florida see it, as an ideological project to take out Venezuela, take out Nicaragua, take out Cuba, and basically eventually isolate Brazil. Because if you don't have Brazil, you don't have Latin America.
Right. And you bring up Chevron, and obviously the U.S. has been more or less at war with Latin America under the guise of the war on drugs. But where does Venezuela fall into this war, especially considering that they don't actually produce very many illegal narcotics that find their way into the United States of America? Is it just the oil? Or is it like, as you just said, they could easily just sign contracts with Maduro to get the oil anyway? So, like, how do you, could you speak a little bit more on this broader ideological mission?
Yeah, it's easy to say, the United States just wants oil, and it's true they do want the oil, but they could get it other ways, right? You could get it by there are other ways in which the United States can get Venezuela's oil, with that, but it is you can't separate interests out from ideology, right? Interests are always ideologically defined, and they basically want to put an end to Venezuela, and they want to put an end to Venezuela, I think, as the first step in bringing down Cuba. Cuba is the real prize, obviously, the real obsession, going back to Benjamin Franklin. But yeah, so Venezuela has a significant amount of oil, and the way it's actually playing out now is, there's a border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana, British Guyana, over, and there's a lot of heavy crude in that area. So Exxon is already starting to drill, and Chevron kind of wants in there. And so in some ways, foreign policy is being played out as a proxy between these two competing oil companies, who maybe on some abstract level have the same interests, but historically have been rivals, within that region, the northern South America.
Like, is there a certain level of like institutional memory and score settling going on here? Like, it goes back to the Hugo Chavez era, and Hugo Chavez and Maduro's government. Like, how are they seen by policy planners in DC?
Well, less DC than Florida, right?
Yeah.
Rubio's from Southern Florida, and it's funny. Cuba has been a thing for over a century. They have the anti-Cuban revolution institutions have been built up and reinvigorated recently, but they're there. They exist. They're like lobby groups. The anti-Chavez, and of course Chavez is dead, to stipulate, but the anti-Chavez groups are more vocal, right? They're more hysterical in some ways. Not that Cuba really isn't ultimately, I think, the main prize, but they really think that Venezuela is on the cusp of collapse. I mean, I don't know if it is or isn't. As to your question about drugs, Venezuela produces very little drugs. It's always been a transshipment point from Colombia and from Bolivia, and most of those drugs anyway come in from the Pacific now, through Ecuador and up the Pacific coast, not through the Caribbean. There's certainly no fentanyl coming from Venezuela, and this has been going on for a long, long time. Venezuela is very, it produces very little drugs, and the idea, they've come up with this total fiction that the justification is that Venezuela doesn't have a state; it's being run by a drug cartel, the Cartel de los Soles, because the military has a sun, sole, on a soul on the insignia on the thing. At best, it's corruption. They look the other way. They probably take bribes. But the idea of describing the whole state as basically not a state, but a narco-state is just pure fiction, pure manufacturing. You could say the same thing about El Salvador. You could certainly say the same thing about Ecuador. And you could have always said the same thing about Colombia when we were feeding billions of dollars into Colombia, which only served to make the problem worse.
I've noticed that the Cartel of the Sun thing, that's been around in sort of like whatever you would call like the successors to the original neocons, the people who were media figures who were like very involved in, the Syrian opposition and Ukraine after that. In about 2014, that's when you started seeing the Cartel of the Sun stuff. And of course, like the reasoning that like the more like Trump aligned people use, that like the military and the cartel, they both use sun insignia. It's like fucking Nancy Drew reasoning. Like how Nancy Drew solves the case.
Yeah, I
Not
mean,
really
there's no
like,
doubt there's corruption, and there's no doubt there's
right.
probably, just like in the United States. I mean, take a look at Fort Bragg. If you wanted to shut a country down,
Right. Well, no, that's the thing. It's the like Trump specific aspect of it, and they've done this with like a few countries that they targeted in Trump one. That it would usually end when Mnuchin or someone said, "Hey, I have money there." It's this idea that like if a country, if they export drugs at all, if one guy has ever sold drugs to an American there, it's a narco state. A cartel runs their fucking government. Which, like, okay, if that's true, I have bad news about Israel for you guys.
Yeah, I mean, and of course it's the history of it. I mean, what we know as the modern cartels in Mexico were created after Nixon established the DEA, and their first major operation was in northern Mexico with the Mexican military, with this militarized assault on poppy, and this Mexico started growing poppy to feed the market for the returning veterans from Southeast Asia. But it was dispersed, and it was peasant. It was small production. It was peasant production, and it wasn't a highly capitalized industry. The relentless militarized assault that the DEA and the Mexican military launched in Mexico, which turned northern Mexico into something that looked very much like Vietnam, just as Vietnam ended. Going after small peasants, disappearing peasants, disappearing peasant activists. It had the effect of creating the first cartels. Like the very first cartels were created as a result of the United States' drug war. And now we're fighting those cartels. And then of course a different episode, like Plan Colombia, all that had the effect of that didn't do anything to stop cocaine coming from Colombia. Twice as much cocaine is grown in Colombia than at the beginning of Plan Colombia, and twice as much land is dedicated to cultivating coca in Colombia than at the beginning of Plan Colombia. All it did was break up the transportation cartels that were relatively stable. I'm not saying they were pacifists, but it wasn't insane violence. But when you break up the transportation cartels, you put a high premium on gangs in Central America and Mexico and would-be cartels to establish territory and routes through these spectacular acts of violence. So new cartels emerge, more violent, that emerge out of that phase of the war on drugs, the Plan Colombia war on drugs, which fed $13 billion into what was undoubtedly a Colombian state that was interpenetrated by drugs much more than Venezuela is, or has been, or if it is even.
I mean, this raises an interesting point. And in the article you sent to us, you give a brief history of the war on drugs, which at this point might as well be the American 100 Years' War. And it may seem counterintuitive, but like, to what extent has the goal of the American-led war on drugs been to facilitate the steady flow of narcotics into the United States by empowering most of the people who produce and traffic drugs in Latin America?
Yeah, I mean, the war on drugs there's lots of different motivations for it, right? There's always been a very close association between both drug production and drug interdiction with right-wing politics, with anti-communist politics. This goes back to Hoover and the FBI using drug interdiction to discredit, what they imagined to be subversives or the police morality and whatnot. But then under COINTELPRO, it became explicitly directed at the peace movement, at the at the civil rights movement, at the Black Power movement, and then of course there was the intertwining of drug production within Latin America with drug interdiction. So it was a common dynamic is that repressive military governments would use the CIA to come to power. Then they would facilitate the cultivation of coca, and then they would start taking DEA money in order to fight the drug war at the same time. So, and so you had this, a very tight kind of intertwinement. And this really took off after the Cuban Revolution, when Castro and the Cuban Revolution ended Havana's nodal function in the Caribbean as as which would brought together this an international drug trade routes, which went from Istanbul to through the Middle East and Italy. It was all set up by Lucky Luciano, and after World War II, when it was working with the CIA on anti-kindness to stop the communists from coming to power in Italy in 1948. But when Castro ended, all of he had the effect of broadcasting these gangsters all into Latin America and into Florida, where they were incorporated into the CIA. I mean, you could really fall down a deep state rabbit hole here, but it's all true. I mean, it's been documented by people like the 60 Minutes and Bill Moyers, as well as more marginal reporters, at least vis-a-vis the establishment.
Like the specific character of the war on drugs in terms of like the drugs that are being imported changes. And like for, cocaine to heroin to crystal meth. And now the big thing is fentanyl. And opiate addiction obviously has led to a great amount of death in this country and a great amount of despair and demoralization as like we see more and more communities succumb to the effects of it. Like, to what extent are like these speedboat murders that are happening in the Caribbean kind of an attempt by the Trump administration to direct people's anger at what they regard as the killing of America by drug dealers, to sort of like identify a target for it and say, look, we're doing something about it?
Yeah, I mean, the drug war was always part of the culture war, and it was always, I mean, right from the beginning with Nixon. I think it was John Ehrlichman who gave that interview. He said where they came up with drugs as a way you couldn't outlaw people's political beliefs or their skin color, but you could outlaw drugs, and that's the way they came out. They did it intentionally to go after black communities and destroy black communities. And so it's always been part of the culture war. But what you see with the rise of the opioid addiction in areas that are the Republican white rank and file base, you see people like J.D. Vance, irresponsibly but persistently ginning up a sense that their pain and their suffering is the result of the betrayal by elites, and certainly the idea that we're gonna murder at will, even though obviously the people piloting those go fast boats aren't globalists. They're not George Soros's son, but still it's the idea of like we're avenging the suffering of Appalachia to the opioid addiction. I mean, they're not bombing the Sackler family house, that's for sure, and they're not, and also it's a degree of empathy that nobody's ever shown for African American communities, during the worst of the crack epidemic.
Another thing I've noticed about this latest iteration is that you said that Trump more or less views the war on drugs not as a metaphor, but as a literal thing that empowers him to go to war even without the express approval of Congress. I mean, he has made comments recently that he's saying,
well, I don't think we're going to necessarily ask for a declaration of war. I think we're just going to kill people that are bringing drugs into our country. Okay, we're going to kill them. They're going to be like dead.
And in addition to that, this is just something from The Atlantic here. It says here, in addition, U.S. officials reportedly told the New York Times last month that the Trump administration had secretly authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela. Doesn't this sort of undermine the whole point of secret covert action when you go in? Usually the New York Times has to work pretty hard to break that story, but it seems now that they're just being told by the Trump administration that they are undertaking covert action in Venezuela.
I know. It's as if they put out a flash, in 1972. We've authorized covert action in Chile. And we've authorized covert action in Guatemala in 1953. No, I know it's all part of the spectacle of it, I think, and the attempt to build a legal case. I mean, the irony of it is that, Trump's predecessors have built the legal case. It was George W. Bush that united the war on drugs with the war on terror and claimed that the authorization for the use of military force gave him the right to use the military to go after for drug interdictions. There's been no shortage of using the U.S. military for drug. I mean, Trump is doing nothing new. The speedboats are new. The murder, and then the passing around the snuff films in the form of the video things, that's new, and that's all part of the spectacle. But every president before him declared that, used the military. I mean, like I said, the DA in Mexico was waging, Vietnam's second act in late 1973. A couple of months after the last combat troop was pulled out of Vietnam, the DEA was, running a scorched earth campaign in northern Mexico with the Mexican military. So, a lot of this stuff isn't new. But Trump does what Trump does. He turns it into spectacle. And other presidents have claimed all of these powers to fight the war on drugs. So but they present it as if, that's the title of the essay that Tom Dispatch, the great Tom Dispatch is sending it out on Thursday, I think, is, escalating the escalation. Every president escalates the war on drugs. Trump is just escalating, a perpetual escalation.